Before we begin, this is a podcast about terrorism, which means we do talk about acts of terrorism and extreme violence, including sexual and gender-based violence. So, you may find some of the following materials upsetting.
Hello, I'm Fatma Ahmed, your host and guide in this series of Taking Apart Terror, the West Africa edition. Together, we'll analyze the realities of violent extremism in West Africa and delve into the local, regional, and international efforts and initiatives to prevent and counter violent extremism. In today's episode, we'll explore the question of what do ISWAP say and what do they do? Joining me as we unpack this question are Malik Samuel, the Lake Chad Basin Program Researcher for the Institute for Security Studies Africa, and Ahmad Jumare from the Neem Foundation. So let's get started. I wanted to ask you both, so what are some of the different acts of violence that ISWAP regularly carry out? Ahmed, do you want to start off the conversation?
Thank you, Fatma. Yes, I think it's quite interesting, some of the trends we've seen over the past few years with ISWAP. There really has been quite an evolution in terms of the way they operate, especially at the community level. We've seen really significant upticks in attacks, especially attacks where you have a significant number of Christian communities. Most recently, we've seen increased attacks on really innocent people, especially women and children in areas of Chibok. We've seen kidnappings. We've heard very gruesome stories by victims, which we have worked with quite actively about rape and several different types of abuse that happens within these ISWAP camps. Alongside this as well, we've seen quite a lot of attacks on military installations, military checkpoints, military facilities, and security agencies at large. And this is, of course, different types of elements that adds up to the experience of the ISWAP attack. And of course, as we have seen over the past few years or so, there has been thousands and thousands of people that have been displaced as a result of these ISWAP attacks. So these are just some, of course, we'll go into much more detail shortly, but these are just some sort of attacks we have seen being carried out by ISWAP.
Thank you, Ahmed. And I think one of the most recent prolific one was the one in Kuje, which is one of Nigeria's most secure prisons. How was ISWAP able to carry out this latest attack? Malik, what are your thoughts?
So regarding Kuje, what our research showed was that attack was specifically meant to free detained members, and that operation owed its success to the collaboration, at least some level of collaboration between ISWAP and Ansaru. Well, Ansaru did not contribute fighters for that attack. The attack, in terms of the manpower for that attack, was supplied entirely by ISWAP. So Ansaru's role in that attack relates to just surveillance, because Ansaru had the surveillance of Kuje for a long time. In fact, Ansaru had planned ways to free its members, but it didn't have the capacity to do that. So it approached ISWAP if they could collaborate to carry out that attack. But ISWAP refused the military collaboration, electing only to use the information provided by Ansaru. And we learned that the reason why ISWAP refused to allow Ansaru's fighters to join it was simply because they felt Ansaru was not an affiliate of ISIS, rather Al-Qaeda. And the condition then was that Ansaru would have to pledge allegiance to ISIS, to be able to join it or to contribute fighters for that attack. So, but I think it was too short a time to do that. So it gave ISWAP the information it had, the intelligence, the surveillance that carried out on Kuje, and that included how to get to Kuje, which route to follow, so that they could avoid military forces, including the timing, what date was better to carry out such an attack, and including the timing. So most of this intelligence, this information was provided by Ansaru, but in terms of the manpower, it was entirely carried out by ISWAP. So what we learned also was that ISWAP has a cell in Kogi State, and that cell was planted sometimes towards the end of last year after the death of Shekau. So what happened was that before the attack, so some ISWAP fighters came all the way from the northeast, specifically from the Alagarno forest and the Lake Chad Basin Island around Tumbuma. So fighters came from these places, to team up with the cell in Kogi, then to come carry out that attack on Kuje.
So you mentioned about this collaboration with ISWAP to carry out this particular attack, and that a conditionality was to pledge allegiances to Daesh, but that was not possible due to the time that this attack was planned. But it would be great for you to elaborate if this is a common in terms of pledging allegiances to Daesh as a conditionality in terms of collaboration amongst some of these fighters.
What I know specifically, it's about the attack on Kuje and what possibly happened, but I don't know about the other cases in other places outside the Lake Chad Basin or in Nigeria specifically. So what I know is only relates to Kuje attack. But then I mentioned that the time was too short. But then what we were seeing recently is that there are discussions ongoing between Ansaru and ISWAP for a possible merger, and also discussions between the two Boko Haram factions in Nigeria, that is the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, and then the Jamaat al-Sunnah Ridawat Wal Jihad, which is JAS, the group formerly led by Shekau. So we're hearing of discussions presently ongoing for a possible collaboration. If that collaboration does happen, we may see situations where attacks, of course, can include fighters either from Ansaru and ISWAP or from the three groups altogether.
Ahmed, coming back to you, you were earlier talking about that we see different types of attacks. It would be great for you to speak of what are some of the key narratives that ISWAP include in their propaganda, specifically when it comes to recruiting.
I think in terms of ISWAP narratives, we've seen quite a bit of learning on their own part in terms of how best to appeal to younger people. Of course, indications that we've seen is that they've learned quite a lot from the mistakes of JAS, particularly the former leader of JAS, Abubakar Shekau, who was killed sometime last year. For instance, some of the things that they've learned in trying to appeal to a civilian audience, you must be seen to really want to embrace them as your fellow Muslims, as ISWAP would call it. So some of the narratives we've seen quite recently actually have been very actively engaged around the concept of the idea that Islam is under attack. There needs to be a concerted effort to protect the religion as a whole. I mean, we've seen instances recently, especially around parts of the northeast in Nigeria, and certainly even areas of Difa, actually, to some extent, even Bagasola area of Chad, where they have really preached some of these narratives to call attention of especially young Muslims, to tell them about some of the gaps within democratic institutions. We've seen instances where they've gone out to communities. In fact, I've had an experience where engaging in a certain community where ISWAP actually had given them letters. And in those letters, they spoke about the need for the community members to strengthen their support for ISWAP. They spoke about the need for community members to move away from really accepting any support from international organizations. They spoke about the communities not accepting any support from the state government, be it the state government or the federal government. We've also seen a lot of instances where they really communicate some of the successes, or at least perceived successes, that they have achieved on the field. Of course, we've seen them communicate using the Almac magazine, as some would call it. But more traditionally, what we're seeing, particularly in the what I would call the peripheral villages, as well as also some had to reach areas where they have access to in this region, you find them preaching through sermons. So when they go into villages, they take over these villages and they really preach through sermons. Sometimes we've seen instances where women have been assigned significant roles within the ranks of ISWAP. You know, that's really interesting in the sense that, I mean, in the past, one of the challenge Boko Haram has had, of course, was how they can enhance recruitment of women. But here we see ISWAP attempting to do that, or have done that in some cases. In other areas, we've also seen them really trying to communicate externally So, for instance, whenever you see impressive example that was given not too long ago by Malik in terms of the incident that happened in the Kuje prison, almost instantly they had put out a video, almost as if to say that, look, here is Abuja and we were able to target Abuja and this is what we have done. So sometimes even that narrative of showing that they're able to compete with conventional armies, even though, of course, any person with common sense would tell you that this is inaccurate. But just a simple video has a lot of impact in terms of how it captures the attention of audiences. So we've seen a range of a multitude of narratives that are being pushed out, especially when it comes to domesticating some of their narratives when they speak about how certain Christians across the country have really starved Muslims of the ability to grow. So these are all sentiments that were existing within the countries that they operate in. But what we find is that they use those pre-existing sentiments, whether it's ethnic or religious, to really grow the divide. And by growing the divide, they're able to actually capture the minds of some of these young people, especially given the fact that Boko Haram in the past have really had a more aggressive way of recruitment. So this is sort of the learning that has happened amongst the operators of the media entity of ISWAP.
You spoke about them managing to recruit women and also their propaganda appealing to young people. Could you tell us a bit more about the child recruitment that's done, in particular in the Lake Chad Basin, by the group?
Thank you. I think there remains a lot of vagueness in the information around as it relates to the recruitment of children. But one thing we do know is that a lot of sources have confirmed that there has been a lot of active recruitment, especially in areas where ISWAP holds sway. What you find is children are almost forced to actually participate. In some cases, actually, you find, of course, for lack of really understanding the dangers, you find children really wanting to engage with these groups that they see as heroes. Of course, as I said, in most cases, you find that this is as a result of the lack of exposure within those communities. In the past, we've seen instances where groups such as Boko Haram have recruited children in numbers. The downside of it is whether they recruit or not. One thing that we know for sure is that a lot of children have died within the ranks of ISWAP. And that is not justified in any way. We've seen in the past, we heard about the 200 children that starved to death in the forest as a result of their engagement with Boko Haram. And as you know, a lot of the commanders that ended up forming the ranks of ISWAP are actually from Boko Haram. So really the shift in the way they embolden their military ranks hasn't really changed significantly, especially when it comes to use of really vulnerable children and women for acts of suicide bombings.
Now, Malik, we've heard from Ahmed in terms of some of the propaganda and the narratives that are being deployed by ISWAP. And you've written also extensively about their, attempted expansions across the Lake Chad Basin and how they're also spreading its propaganda. It'd be great to hear your thoughts around, how some of ISWAP's claim or propaganda tie into the official Daesh propaganda and how it also ties to their expansion across the Lake Chad Basin.
So, thanks. Thank you. But just to add to what Ahmed said, regarding children, the recruitment of children. This is ISWAP sees children, especially young boys, as the future, especially its fighting force. And he mentioned the death of children in the forest. If I understand correctly, that would be under Shekau, when Shekau was alive, about 10 years ago, 8 or so years ago, when a lot of children died. The Darukoral system, which is a system put in place to radicalize young boys. Now, you realize that in early this year, ISWAP released a video, the empowerment video, showing these young boys being well taken care of, undergoing training and exercise, and all that. So that is to show that ISWAP is different from JAS, to show that if these boys agreed to join, they will be well taken care of, they will be well fed, well clothed, provided with most of the things they need. So all these are strategies that are meant to attract these young boys. But of course, like Ahmed mentioned as well, the risk far outweigh whatever benefit ISWAP puts out there for the children, which of course it doesn't tell the children in terms of the risk. Because during this radicalization, they are introduced to the battlefield. And they start gradually by becoming cheerleaders, where young boys are taken to the battlefield behind to do what they call kabara, to shout Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, to motivate the fighters. And some of them are also expected to help the fighters carry some of their weapons, especially the ammunition, and also help in retrieving the corpses of fighters. So these are all a part of the strategy that ISWAP uses in carrying out recruitment. Then you talk about the extension and how this ties into Daesh and strategy. One thing that is clear is that ISWAP has a very, very active media unit, and that media unit is always in touch when necessary with the media unit of ISIS. The ISWAP media unit is headed by the son of the late founder, Mohammed Yusuf. So his son heads that media unit. So that tells how important it is. And they have reporters, and that is how they are able to get a lot of these media materials, videos, pictures, and all that they are able to put information out immediately an attack happens. In fact, let me even add that the operation in Sambisa Forest that resulted in the death of Shekau, that operation was sanctioned by ISIS. ISIS told ISWAP that, look, if you want to expand beyond the Lake Chad Islands, which is very far from the capital of Borno State, which is Maiduguri, you need to be close to the capital in order to be able to carry out attacks close to this capital. To do this, you need to get Sambisa as a base. And to take Sambisa, you first have to take out the leader, which was Abubakar Shekau. So that gave ISWAP the mandate, to carry out the attack on Sambisa and eventually kill Abubakar Shekau.
Ahmed, do you want to come in and compliment about some of your thoughts around how ISWAP's propaganda also maybe differ from Daesh's one?
But I think the best example I give people is I've had the opportunity to really listen to and manage a lot of radio programs, both recently and as well in the past in the Northeast. And what we started hearing actually from some of the callers is they're able to differentiate between incidents that are carried out by JAS or Boko Haram, as they would call it locally, and ISWAP. You had actually callers saying, okay, look, we heard about this thing. This is Boko Haram that committed this attack. What JAS has done, and I think Malik summed it up quite well actually, is to be able to really through his media present itself as really a more legitimate alternative to Boko Haram, JAS. And that's essentially the main focus of some of the messaging they push out. And if you notice, even when they talk about attacks that they have committed against, whether it's members of the military or other security services across the LCB, they always make reference that when they fought for the Dawla of Islam, they keep making reference to the people that they're doing it for. And with that, sometimes you find that a lot of the community members now move away from seeing them as a threat to seeing them as an active group that's operating in the region as a whole. This is a lot of the challenges we're seeing, especially with whether it's governments or agencies trying to counter the narratives.
No, thank you. Those are fascinating insights, especially how they try and win the community over. Do you both have any thoughts around, we've talked about some of their propaganda, their strategy, and also ways that tactics of, getting the community on. Before we wrap up today, do you have anything that you want to speak of, any final words around, preventative measures or things that we can take away from this episode to take forward in terms of preventing, whether it's from their propaganda, the attacks or the strategies? It would be great to hear your final thoughts on it.
A lot of times you hear, statements such as, it's not rocket science, but sometimes it's actually the situation we find ourselves in is actually quite complex. We live in the context of the conflict we're talking about now is different from the context of the conflict we're talking about 2 years ago. And I'll give you an example. When you look at parts of Chad, parts of Niger, whether it's Boso, Tilaberi or Difa, or even the northwest region of Nigeria where ISWAP has expanded to, as well as also to some extent the north central.
And I think, Ahmed, Malik, do you want to share any final reflections from your side?
I'd like to focus mainly on the propaganda, ISWAP propaganda. I think ISWAP deploys that successfully to show or to try to convince people about its potential and about its strength. But the truth is that a lot of things are happening behind the scene that ISWAP does not want people to know. So I think the focus also should be on countering this propaganda. ISWAP understands the significance, the importance of information, and that is why it engages in this propaganda. For instance, the video released earlier this year about children, the empowerment, the recruitment video and all that. But behind the scene, you speak to a lot of former child recruits. They tell you, the suffering, the abuse. Ahmad has talked about some of the abuses happening in communities, even communities where ISWAP tends to show that it cares for the people, but this is not entirely true. So what I think stakeholders should focus on should also be to counter this narrative that that ISWAP puts out. We've seen attacks by ISWAP on communities, but ISWAP comes out to tell you it doesn't attack civilians, especially Muslim civilians. But there have been several incidents of ISWAP fighters raiding communities, even Muslim communities, and attacking civilians. So focus should be on messaging, that tend to counter this narrative.
So by exposing and challenging some of their ISWAP's propaganda is also a way for us to undermine the group as well. Well, thank you, Malik and Ahmed, for helping guide us through today's discussion. Your insights were informative and really deeply insightful. So that's it for today's episode. In the next episode, we'll be asking, what roles do women play in supporting and defeating terrorism? Please follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Fatma Ahmed. Until next time, goodbye.